Psalm 76, the majestic God who judges and delivers. Psalm 76 is an expression of God's majesty, power, and role as the righteous judge of the earth. Attributed to Asaph and intended for performance with stringed instruments, the psalm reflects on a moment of divine intervention in history, likely the defeat of a threatening military force, and elevates that event into a timeless declaration of God's authority over both heaven and earth. It emphasizes not only God's supremacy over all human power but also his commitment to justice, especially in defense of the oppressed. The psalm opens with a declaration that God is known in Judah and his name is great in Israel. This sets the tone by affirming that the God of the covenant is not a distant but one who has revealed himself among his people. Salem, an ancient name for Jerusalem, and Zion are named as his dwelling place, underscoring the idea that God's presence is not abstract but tied to a real place and a real people. His tabernacle, representing his presence, is not just symbolic, it is the place from which he acts on behalf of his people. The reference to God breaking the arrows, shields, and swords of battle signals his direct intervention in a military conflict. This is not merely poetic imagery but likely a reference to a historical event, such as the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrians during Hezekiah's reign, when an angel of the Lord struck down a large enemy force in a single night. The psalmist then moves from description to praise, proclaiming that God is more glorious and excellent than the mountains of prey, a likely metaphor for proud and powerful kingdoms that dominate others. In contrast to these earthly powers, which take by force, God reigns in true majesty. The stout-hearted warriors are rendered helpless by God's judgment, they sleep the sleep of death, unable to use their hands or weapons. This divine victory is not the result of a human army but comes from God's rebuke alone. Horses and chariots, symbols of military strength, are cast into a dead sleep, highlighting how effortlessly God can overthrow what seems invincible to human eyes. As the psalm progresses, the focus shifts to God's terrifying holiness. The psalmist declares that God is to be feared and poses a rhetorical question: who can stand before him when he is angry? The implied answer is no one. This fear is not merely dread but deep reverence for God's unmatched authority. When God issues judgment from heaven, the entire earth responds in awe and silence. This dramatic image paints God as the supreme judge whose voice stills the noise of human rebellion and whose justice brings peace. His purpose is not arbitrary destruction but the deliverance of the oppressed. God's judgment, therefore, is not only terrifying but righteous, bringing about a moral order that defends the vulnerable and humbles the proud. Perhaps one of the most striking assertions in the psalm is found in verse 10, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise you, with the remainder of wrath you shall gird yourself." This statement suggests that even human anger and rebellion, forces typically opposed to God's will, are ultimately used to serve his purposes. God is so sovereign that he can transform even the defiance of his enemies into occasions for his glory. What wrath remains after his judgment, he controls and uses like a weapon at his side. This points to a vision of divine providence in which nothing is wasted, and all events, even those that seem evil or chaotic, are woven into God's ultimate plan. The psalm concludes with a call to response. The people are exhorted to make vows to God and fulfill them, and all surrounding nations are invited to bring offerings to the one who ought to be feared. Worship is not just an internal posture but an external act of loyalty and honor. The final verse reinforces God's dominion over rulers. He cuts off the spirit of princes and is awesome to the kings of the earth. In other words, no position of human power is beyond his reach. Earthly leaders, who often consider themselves autonomous, are reminded that their authority is subject to God's higher rule. Psalm 76 is a reflection on God's active presence in history, his incomparable power over earthly forces, and his role as the just defender of the oppressed. It teaches that God's judgment, though fearsome, is always righteous and aimed at establishing justice. It calls all people, Israelites and foreigners, commoners and kings alike, to respond in worship, awe, and submission. Through poetic imagery and powerful declarations, the psalm affirms that God alone is to be feared, trusted, and praised.
Psalm 76. To the chief musician, on stringed instruments, a psalm of Asaph, a song. In Judah God is known, his name is great in Israel. In Salem also is his tabernacle, and his dwelling place in Zion. There he broke the arrows of the bow, the shield and sword of battle. Selah. You are more glorious and excellent than the mountains of prey. The stout-hearted were plundered, they have sunk into their sleep, and none of the mighty men have found the use of their hands. At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both the chariot and horse were cast into a dead sleep. You yourself are to be feared, and who may stand in your presence when once you are angry? You caused judgment to be heard from heaven. The earth feared and was still, when God arose to judgment, to deliver all the oppressed of the earth. Selah. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you, with the remainder of wrath you shall gird yourself. Make vows to the Lord your God, and pay them. Let all who are around him bring presents to him who ought to be feared. He shall cut off the spirit of princes. He is awesome to the kings of the earth.